What if a single night could change everything? He and she got married without love, just out of convenience. But when the first night arrived, something they both denied feeling awakened with a force impossible to ignore. Tell me, where are you watching from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to discover how one night can transform two destinies. The door of the suite at the historic Biltmore estate in Asheville closed behind them with a soft click that seemed to resonate like thunder in the oppressive silence. Griffin Blackwood remained by the window, his aristocratic profile silhouetted against the twinkling lights of the mountain city, while Imogen Reed held the bouquet of white roses in her trembling hands. Outside, the estate's gardens stretched majestically, a centuries-old witness to strategic alliances and calculated unions. Inside, two strangers bound by the signing of a contract rather than by the invisible threads of love. "Would you like some champagne?" His deep voice broke the silence like breaking the ice on a frozen lake. Cautiously, testing its solidity, Imogen nodded without raising her eyes. "Yes, thank you." Shadows danced on the ancient walls as Griffin poured the golden liquid into two crystal flutes. The clinking of glasses echoed in the room like a carillon announcing the beginning of something. But of what exactly, neither could predict. "To our arrangement," he said, raising his glass. "To our arrangement," she repeated, finally meeting his gaze. Sometimes it is in the silences between the agreed words that the deepest truths begin to take root, invisible even to those who bear them. 6 months earlier, Imogen's heels clicked nervously on the marble floor of the law office in Boston. A crumpled folder under her arm and the weight of a crushing debt on her shoulders, she followed the secretary through a maze of corridors whose walls were adorned with impressive diplomas. "Ms. Montgomery will see you now," announced the secretary, opening a dark wooden door. The attorney's office was as intimidating as her reputation, minimalist, cold, efficient, like the woman herself, who rose to greet her with a professional smile that didn't reach her piercing eyes. "Miss Reed, I presume. Please have a seat." Imogen placed her folder on the immaculately organized desk. "I've brought all the documents regarding the library. Tell me about your situation," the attorney asked, interlacing her perfectly manicured fingers. The words tumbled out as Imogen revealed the story of the Reed Library, that literary jewel nestled in Boston's historic district. Founded by her great-grandfather in 1896, it had survived 2 world wars and the digital era thanks to its unique collection of manuscripts and first editions. "My grandfather left it to me 3 years ago, but the structural repairs cost much more than expected." Her voice trembled slightly. "I've sold family heirlooms, organized fundraisers, but the bank demands full repayment within 30 days. Attorney Montgomery tapped her pen against her perfectly red lips. "How much?" $450,000. The attorney nodded, her face betraying no emotion. Then she rose and walked to the window, contemplating Boston's skyline bathed in afternoon sunlight. "I might have a solution," she finally said, "but it's unconventional." She returned to her desk and opened a drawer from which she extracted a folder marked simply GB. "I have a client who's looking to conclude a matrimonial arrangement for inheritance reasons. He would cover your debt entirely and much more." Imogen's heart skipped a beat. "A matrimonial arrangement? You mean a marriage of convenience?" "Yes," the attorney confirmed. "Temporary, of course. 2 years with a discreet separation and generous compensation at the end." Imogen's cheeks flushed with shame and indignation. "I'm not for sale, Ms. Montgomery." The attorney smiled, a genuine smile this time, almost understanding. "No one is suggesting that, Miss Reed. Rather, consider this a mutually beneficial contract. You preserve your family's cultural heritage, and my client preserves his." Imogen stared at the photographs of the library spread across the desk, the century-old shelves, the stained glass windows, the worn armchairs where generations of children had discovered the magic of words. "Who is he?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible. "Griffin Blackwood." The name resonated in the room like that of a mythical figure. Even Imogen, who lived more in the pages of ancient books than in modern current events, recognized this emblematic name of luxury real estate development on the East Coast. "I want to think about it," she murmured. "Of course," nodded the attorney, "but the bank won't think for long." The same day, 400 miles away, Griffin Blackwood gazed at the Atlantic Ocean from his office on the top floor of the Blackwood Tower in Newport. At 42, He had built an empire stretching from Cape Cod to the Hamptons. Luxury hotel complexes, private residences for billionaires, exclusive marinas. His name was synonymous with success, power, perfection. Yet today, he felt as powerless as a child. His phone vibrated, displaying his legal advisor's name. "Any news?" he asked without preamble. "Miss Montgomery met with a potential candidate today," replied the voice at the other end. "Her young woman from Boston, owner of a historic library in financial difficulty. Higher education, good family but no money, physically presentable. She matches your criteria." Griffin passed a hand over his tired face. "And she accepted. She's thinking about it, but time is running short for her too." He hung up and headed to the safe hidden behind a massive abstract painting. Opening it, he extracted not jewelry or confidential documents, but a simple journal bound in worn leather. His father's journal, Edmund Blackwood, the unyielding patriarch of a New England family who had transformed a modest construction company into an international conglomerate. A man Griffin had spent his life trying to impress, in vain. He opened it to the page marked with a faded ribbon and reread for the 100th time the passage that had turned his life upside down 6 months earlier, discovered only after the notary had revealed the existence of this surprising testamentary clause. "A man without family is but a man without roots. The empire I built is not destined to be directed by a bachelor obsessed with profit. If my son has not established a family before his 43rd birthday, leadership will be transferred to the family council. This is not a punishment. It's a lesson about what truly matters." Griffin closed the journal abruptly. His father had always been a manipulator, even from the grave, and now he found himself cornered with 8 months to marry or lose control of the company he had made prosper, well beyond his father's dreams. He returned to the window. Below, white yachts danced on the blue water, like puzzle pieces seeking their place. Like him. His reflection in the glass returned the image of an attractive man, but with cold eyes, marked by a hard-earned mistrust. The image of Olivia crossed his mind. Beautiful, ambitious Olivia, who had left him the day she realized he wouldn't yield to her demands for access to the company's offshore accounts. "Never again," he murmured to his reflection. "Never feelings again. Just a contract, that's all it will be." The first meeting took place in a private salon at the Lenox Hotel in Boston. Attorney Montgomery had arranged the scene with precision: dim lighting, spectacular view of the Charles River, discreet service. Griffin arrived first, punctual to the second, dressed in a navy blue tailored suit that emphasized his athletic figure maintained by daily swimming sessions. He deliberately chose to sit with his back to the view, preferring to observe the entrance. When Imogen crossed the threshold, he was surprised. The previous candidates, presented by the attorney, were invariably cut from the same cloth, ambitious models or calculating socialites. This woman was different. She wore a simple burgundy dress that seemed to have known several fashion seasons, flat shoes, and her chestnut hair was gathered in a loose bun. No ostentatious jewelry, just a thin silver chain with a tiny book-shaped pendant. Her hazel eyes explored the room with intelligent curiosity rather than the predatory assessment he was accustomed to. He rose to greet her, noting that she was shorter than he had imagined. "Miss Reed," he said, extending his hand. "Griffin Blackwood." She shook his hand with surprising firmness. "Mr. Blackwood." Attorney Montgomery smiled, satisfied. "I'll leave you to get acquainted while I take care of the details with the maitre d'." An awkward silence settled after the attorney's departure. It was Imogen who broke it. "I prefer to be direct, Mr. Blackwood." "Why me?" The question caught him off guard. He had prepared for negotiations on financial terms, not for this disarming frankness. "Because you need money for a cause you care about, not for personal whims," he answered honestly. "And because you don't have connections in my world that could complicate matters." She nodded, visibly appreciating his frankness. "And the duration would be 2 years?" "Yes, long enough to satisfy the legal requirements, short enough for each of us to resume our lives afterward." The waiter brought tea and pastries that neither of them touched. "What would be my obligations?" she asked, her cheeks turning slightly pink. He immediately understood the nature of her question. "Our marriage would be a public facade only. We would share a residence for appearances, but your private life would remain your own. I would simply ask you to attend some professional events by my side." Relief crossed her face. And in exchange, I'll pay off your debts in full, establish an endowment fund that will guarantee the survival of your library for the next 50 years, and you'll receive compensation of $2 million upon our separation. She took a trembling breath. That's considerable. It's fair, he corrected. I'm asking for 2 years of your life. Imogen looked out the window, watching the illuminated skyline in the distance. Then she turned to him, with new determination in her gaze. I accept, but I have an additional condition. He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Which is? I want to continue working at the library during these 2 years. It's non-negotiable. An unexpected smile stretched Griffin's lips. I admire your determination, Miss Reed. Deal. When Attorney Montgomery returned, she found them discussing practical details like business associates. She smiled, satisfied. It was exactly the kind of clinical arrangement she had hoped for, without emotional complications, without drama, just a mutually advantageous contract. She couldn't know how wrong she was. Boston City Hall sparkled under the fine rain of that autumn Thursday. Black umbrellas formed an orderly procession on the steps of the historic building. About 20 carefully selected guests, mainly Griffin's business partners and some local cultural figures invited to lend credibility to this unlikely union. In a small waiting room, Imogen contemplated her reflection in an antique mirror. The ivory silk dress, borrowed from the famous designer on Newbury Street, perfectly embraced her silhouette. Simple, elegant, but without the romantic embellishments she had secretly dreamed of in her youth. Her trembling fingers adjusted the small book-shaped pendant that never left her neck, the last gift from her grandfather. The door opened softly, revealing not Griffin, but an elderly woman with an aristocratic bearing. Forgive my intrusion, she said with a pronounced southern accent. I'm Eleanor Thornhill, the head librarian of the Charleston Historical Society. I wanted to meet you before the ceremony. Imogen smiled, recognizing this respected name in the American literary world. It's an honor, ma'am. The elderly woman approached, scrutinizing Imogen with unsettling intensity. I knew your grandfather, you know, a man of remarkable erudition. You knew Grandpa William. We corresponded for years about the preservation of medieval manuscripts. She paused. He would be proud of your efforts to save the library, but not of the way I'm doing it, Imogen completed, her throat tight. Eleanor took Imogen's hands in hers. I didn't come to judge, my dear. I came to tell you that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with unexpected first pages. Before Imogen could respond, the door opened again. It was Griffin, impeccable in his charcoal grey suit, a white rosebud in his buttonhole. It's time, he said simply. The ceremony was brief and formal. The mayor, a political friend of Griffin's, pronounced the required words without flourishes. When the time came to exchange rings, a palpable discomfort pervaded the room. No one had anticipated this symbolic detail. It was Griffin who saved the situation by pulling out of his pocket 2 white gold rings, simple, elegant, evidently purchased at the last minute. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, causing an unexpected shiver in Imogen. You may kiss the bride, announced the mayor. A moment of panic crossed Griffin's gaze. They hadn't discussed this ritual. Imogen, sensing his hesitation, took the initiative and rose on tiptoes to place a quick kiss on his cheek. A disappointed murmur ran through the assembly, but the newlyweds ignored it. The reception that followed in a private salon of the same building was as brief as the ceremony. The guests drank champagne, exchanged business jokes, and quickly departed for other obligations. No one gave a moving speech. No one tossed the bouquet. It was less a wedding than a business merger sealed by signatures rather than hearts. As the last guest left, Griffin approached Imogen with 2 train tickets. Our car is waiting to take us to the station, he said. We'll be in Asheville in a few hours. She nodded, gathering her small bag and the bouquet of white roses that an anonymous florist had delivered just before the ceremony. In the luxurious car that drove them through Boston's wet streets, Imogen looked out the window at passers-by running for shelter from the rain, completely unaware that her life had just irrevocably changed. She turned to Griffin, who was checking his emails on his phone. Thank you for the rings, she said softly. I hadn't thought of that. He looked up, surprised. It was the minimum for credibility. They're beautiful. An uncomfortable silence settled. Then, against all expectations, he put away his phone and turned to her. "How do you feel, Mrs. Blackwood?" The use of this new name made her start. "Strange, as if I've borrowed someone else's identity." He nodded, understanding. "It will pass. In a few weeks it will just be routine." But as the train sped south through landscapes of fall-gilded forests, Imogen wondered if anything in this situation could ever feel normal. The door of the suite at the Biltmore estate in Asheville closed behind them with a soft click that seemed to resonate like thunder. Griffin remained by the window, watching the lights of the mountain city, while Imogen held the bouquet of white roses in her trembling hands. "Would you like some champagne?" he offered, breaking the oppressive silence. "Gladly," she replied, finally setting down the bouquet on a console table. He uncorked the bottle, waiting for them in an ice bucket, pouring the golden liquid into 2 crystal flutes. Their fingers brushed when he handed her the glass, causing that same strange shiver that Imogen had felt during the exchange of rings. "To our collaboration," he proposed, raising his glass. "To our collaboration," she repeated, sketching a timid smile. They drank in silence, each desperately seeking a topic of conversation that wouldn't highlight the strangeness of their situation. "Have you visited Asheville before?" he finally asked. "Once, as a child. My grandfather would take me every summer to discover a different historic city." Her eyes lit up at the memory. "I was fascinated by the Vanderbilt legacy. I have a soft spot for the Blue Ridge Mountains," he confessed. "The idea of this wilderness that remains untamed despite civilization encroaching. These mountains are my home. There my heart shall ever be." She hummed softly, before interrupting herself, embarrassed by her own spontaneity. An unexpected smile lit up Griffin's usually severe face. "Exactly." A less tense silence settled. Imogen scanned the luxurious suite, the period furniture, the paintings by American masters, the king-size bed that loomed like an elephant in the room. "I'll take the couch," Griffin offered, following her gaze. "It looks comfortable enough." She nodded, grateful. "Thank you." She approached the bookcase that adorned an entire wall, running her fingertips over the titles. "Oh, they have a first edition of Thoreau's Walden. You've read it?" he inquired, surprised. "Several times. I'm rereading it currently, actually." She caressed the binding with reverence. Thoreau so perfectly captures the despair of being trapped in a life that doesn't match our dreams. A shadow passed over Griffin's face. An interesting reading choice for a young bride. She blushed slightly. "I forgot you might know this book." "Why the surprise?" "Business executives don't read classics." "That's not what I meant. Actually, it was one of my favorite books as a teenager," he confessed, approaching the bookcase. "My literature professor at Phillips Exeter Academy was a Thoreau enthusiast. He made us analyze every nuance, every metaphor." "You went to Exeter? I studied at St. Paul's." "Really? What a coincidence. Was Mr. Harrison already teaching in your time?" Griffin's face lit up. "The tall-bearded man with the thunderous voice? The one who quoted Emerson at every opportunity?" "That's him," she laughed. "He hasn't changed then. He gave me the taste for rare books." For the next 2 hours, they forgot the contract that bound them, the hotel room, the problematic bed. Seated in armchairs near the window, they talked about books, memorable teachers, Boston in the rain, favorite libraries. Imogen discovered that Griffin had initially wanted to study architecture before his father pushed him toward business. He learned that she had briefly considered a career as a museum curator before taking over the family business. "It's getting late," he finally said, noticing it was almost midnight. "You must be tired." She nodded, suddenly brought back to the reality of their situation. "Yes, the day has been intense." They prepared for the night with the awkward politeness of strangers sharing an intimate space. When Imogen emerged from the bathroom, dressed in cotton pajamas, deliberately the least seductive in her collection, Griffin had already set up sheets and a pillow on the couch. "Good night, Imogen," he said simply. "Good night, Griffin," she replied, slipping into the immense bed. In the darkness, lying under the luxurious sheets, Imogen stared at the ceiling. A few feet away from her, her legal husband, this stranger with whom she had just shared more personal memories than with anyone else in recent years, breathed calmly. The most carefully planned arrangements, she thought, can sometimes take directions that no contract could anticipate. The first days in Griffin's apartment in Newport were an awkward ballet of polite avoidances. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a building facing the ocean, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a 360-degree view of the Atlantic and the coastal landscape. Imogen had a suite with her own bathroom and a small sitting room that she quickly transformed into a personal library. Griffin, true to his word, had arranged daily transportation so she could continue working at the library in Boston 3 days a week. They developed a routine. Breakfast together at 6:30, polite conversations about the weather or current events, then each went their separate way. Separate dinners most of the time, as Griffin rarely returned before 10 p.m. On weekends, she explored Newport and its surroundings, while he generally worked in his home office. It was at the beginning of the second month that things began to change. One morning, Imogen found an antique book on the breakfast table, a rare edition of Emerson's Essays. "I thought of you when I saw it at an antiquarian in Charleston," Griffin explained upon seeing her questioning look. "For your personal collection." She caressed the red Morocco binding, deeply touched. "Thank you. That's very thoughtful." A fleeting smile crossed his usually impassive face. "You're welcome." That evening, for the first time, she prepared dinner. A traditional New England clam chowder whose recipe came from her maternal grandmother. When Griffin returned, the aroma filled the apartment. "You cooked?" He was astonished. "I hope you like seafood," she said, setting the dishes on the terrace. He remained silent during the first mouthfuls, then raised his eyes to her, an indecipherable emotion in his gaze. "It's exactly like what my nanny used to make when I was a child in Cape Cod." "How did you know?" She smiled. "I didn't. It's simply a family recipe." This dinner marked a turning point. Breakfast lengthened, conversations moving beyond banalities to address more personal subjects. Griffin began coming home earlier some evenings. Imogen took to cooking regularly. She discovered his taste for traditional American dishes, clam bakes, pot roast, apple pie. Those simple but comforting foods that reminded him of a childhood he rarely mentioned. One Thursday evening, 2 months after their wedding, Griffin asked her to accompany him to a charity dinner at the Breakers in Newport. "It's for the Foundation for the Preservation of Maritime Heritage," he explained. "Many of my associates will be there. It would be appropriate for you to accompany me." She hesitated. It was the first time he had asked her to truly play her role as wife in public. "Of course. What attire would be suitable?" "My stylist will bring you some options tomorrow," he said before adding almost timidly, "but I'm certain your taste is excellent. Choose what you prefer." On the Saturday of the dinner, Imogen was nervous. The dress she had chosen, a creation in midnight blue silk that recalled the color of the Atlantic at twilight, was more elegant than anything she had ever worn. Her hair, styled by Griffin's personal stylist, was gathered in a sophisticated chignon that highlighted her graceful neck and the sapphire necklace that Griffin had delivered that morning. "To complete the outfit," simply said the card that accompanied it. When she emerged from her room, Griffin was waiting for her in the living room. His gaze lingered on her in a way that brought an unexpected warmth to her chest. "You're magnificent," he said simply. In the private helicopter that transported them to the event, Imogen tried to mask her nervousness. "Are these people important for your business?" "Some, yes. Others are simply figures from Newport society." He hesitated before adding, "Vanessa Harrington will be there." Something in his voice caught Imogen's attention. "Who is she?" "A business partner from the Hamptons. We've developed several properties together." He adjusted his tie, an unusual gesture that betrayed a certain discomfort. "She had certain expectations regarding me before our marriage." "Oh," was all Imogen could respond, suddenly aware of the complexity of the life she had entered. The dinner was sumptuous. 300 guests in the historic Grand Hall, chamber orchestra, starred chefs. Imogen observed with fascination this world that was foreign to her, where conversations oscillated between 7-figure donations and the latest exhibitions at the Newport Art Museum. Griffin introduced her with a pride that seemed sincere, his hand placed lightly in the small of her back. She caught some curious glances, some whispers behind improvised fans, but nothing openly hostile, until Vanessa Harrington's arrival. Tall, sculpted, with a mane of flaming red hair and piercing green eyes, she cut through the crowd like a warship through calm waters. Her blood-red dress and unshakable confidence created an intimidating aura. "Griffin, darling," she purred, embracing him on both cheeks, lingering a bit too long. "What a pleasure to finally see you. I've missed you terribly these past months." Her Connecticut accent rolled like waves against rocks. Her eyes fell on Imogen with a cold assessment that didn't match her dazzling smile. "And here is the mysterious wife everyone's talking about. Pleased to meet you, my dear." Imogen shook the extended hand, immediately feeling the claws beneath the silk gloves. "The pleasure is mine, Miss Harrington. I've heard about your innovative real estate projects in East Hampton." A flash of surprise crossed Vanessa's gaze. "Really? I didn't think librarians were interested in luxury real estate." "My wife is interested in numerous subjects," Griffin intervened with a protective note in his voice. "Her knowledge of historical architecture has proven valuable for several of our new projects." Vanessa slightly narrowed her eyes. "How fascinating. A marriage of convenience that proves useful." Her gaze slid to Imogen's hand, where the white gold wedding band shone. "Though hasty, no. I still remember our conversation in the Hamptons last April, Griffin, where you swore that personal commitments weren't in your plans." The atmosphere immediately tensed. Imogen felt Griffin stiffen beside her. "Circumstances change, Vanessa," he responded coldly. "Evidently." Her gaze returned to Imogen, evaluating her as one would a racehorse. "I suppose provincial inexperience has its charm, a bit like returning to rustic vacations after having tasted luxury. Refreshing for a while." Imogen felt the sting of the insult, but maintained her composure, remembering what was at stake. "Simplicity has its virtues, Miss Harrington, like frankness." A tense silence settled. Then, to Imogen's surprise, Griffin took her hand and squeezed it gently. "We'll have to excuse ourselves, Vanessa. The Foundation's president is waiting for us." He turned to Imogen with a look of new intensity. "Come, darling." As they walked away, Imogen felt Griffin's arm wrap around her waist in a possessive gesture that had nothing feigned about it. She looked up at him, troubled by the anger she read on his usually impassive face. "I'm sorry about that," he murmured. "Vanessa can be territorial. You don't need to apologize. It's not as if we—" She broke off, unable to formulate exactly what they were or weren't. He stopped, looking at her with an indecipherable expression. "Nevertheless, no one speaks to you like that. Ever." That evening, in the hotel suite they shared in Newport, Imogen waited for his return well after midnight. He had been detained by business discussions, but she couldn't bring herself to sleep before speaking with him. When he entered, loosening his tie with a tired gesture, she was sitting in an armchair near the window. "You're still awake," he noted, surprised. "I wanted to thank you," she said softly, "for defending me tonight." He approached, sitting on the edge of the bed across from her. "It was the least I could do." "No, it wasn't obligatory. Our contract doesn't stipulate that you must defend me against disparaging remarks." Their gazes met in the half-light, and something passed between them, a silent recognition that the carefully drawn lines of their arrangement were beginning to fade. "Some things shouldn't need to be written in a contract, Imogen," he murmured. That night, although they still slept in separate beds, something had changed. A door had cracked open between their two worlds, letting in a light that neither was ready to name. The third month brought the first real challenges. One morning, as they shared their now habitual breakfast on the terrace, Griffin received a call that instantly transformed his expression. "How is that possible?" His voice, usually controlled, vibrated with contained anger. "Who authorized access to these documents?" Imogen observed him in silence, recognizing the signs of a professional crisis. When he hung up, his face was grave. "Problems?" she asked softly. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she had rarely observed. "My father's family, cousins and uncles who have always coveted control of the company, have hired private investigators to look into our marriage." Her heart tightened. "They suspect something. They're looking for evidence that our union is a facade." He looked at her directly. "They'll probably approach you, offering money for you to confess." "I would never do that," she responded firmly. "Money can be very persuasive, Imogen." "Not as much as my word," she retorted, hurt by his apparent lack of trust. A strange expression crossed his face, a mixture of surprise and something that almost resembled admiration. "I believe you," he finally said. "Forgive my distrust. Experience has made me cautious." His words awakened Imogen's curiosity. A particular experience. He turned his gaze toward the ocean horizon, silent for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. I was engaged 12 years ago. Olivia, a journalist I had met during an interview. Beautiful, brilliant, apparently passionate about the same things that interested me. Imogen waited, sensing he was sharing something he usually kept buried. The wedding was scheduled for June. In April, I discovered she was secretly working on an exposé about my company's business practices, using our private conversations and documents she had access to because of me. "I'm sorry," Imogen murmured. "The most ironic thing is that we had nothing to hide. Our practices have always been above board. But her betrayal—" He clenched his fists. "Since then, I keep my distance. Business and pleasure don't mix. And here I am," she said softly, "a perfect mix of both." An unexpected smile softened his features. "You're different." These simple words resonated between them with a troubling intensity. The following week confirmed Griffin's fears. While Imogen was working at the library in Boston, an elegant woman presented herself, asking for a private consultation on rare manuscripts. Once in Imogen's office, she revealed her true identity, an attorney representing the Blackwood family. $500,000, she announced without preamble, pushing a tablet toward Imogen. "Sign this declaration confirming the fictitious nature of your marriage, and the money is yours immediately." Imogen looked at the sum displayed on the screen, more than enough to completely renovate the library, buy thousands of new volumes, and live comfortably for years. "And if I refuse?" "We'll continue investigating, and we will find evidence, Miss Reed. No one marries without love, without leaving traces." Imogen stood, her calm masking her boiling anger. "It's Mrs. Blackwood," she corrected, "and you're wasting your time." When she recounted the incident to Griffin that evening, she was surprised by his reaction. Not the cold anger she expected, but genuine concern. "They threatened you?" he asked, his features tense. Not explicitly, but the message was clear. He approached her, hesitating before gently taking her hands in his. "I'm sorry for involving you in this situation. Perhaps we should reconsider our options." She squeezed his hands, surprised by the warmth that spread from this simple contact. "I don't break my commitments, Griffin. Never." Their gazes met, and for a dizzying moment, Imogen thought he was going to kiss her. But the phone rang, breaking the moment. It was Griffin's lawyer, with news that would change everything. "An addendum to the will?" Griffin's voice rose dangerously. "Why wasn't I informed of this before?" Imogen watched him, growing concern filling her as his face paled. "What does this mean exactly?" he asked, eyes fixed on her as he listened to the answer. "I see, yes. We'll discuss it." When he hung up, a heavy silence invaded the room. "Griffin, what's happening?" He sat down heavily as if the weight of the world had just fallen on his shoulders. "There's an additional clause in my father's will, one that Attorney Montgomery deliberately omitted mentioning." He took a deep breath. "The marriage will only be considered valid for inheritance purposes if a child is born within 3 years. Imogen felt the ground give way beneath her feet. A child. An heir, to be precise. "She knew?" Imogen asked, betrayal knotting her stomach. "Apparently. She was handsomely paid by my cousins to omit this information." Imogen collapsed onto the couch beside him, stunned. Their carefully negotiated arrangement, their meticulously planned lives, everything was shattering. "What are our options?" she finally asked. "We can end the agreement now. You keep everything that was agreed upon so far. I'll find another way to handle the company situation." The ease with which he proposed this solution hurt her in a way she hadn't anticipated. "Is that what you want?" He looked at her, visibly torn. "What I want doesn't matter. What was supposed to be a simple arrangement has become complicated. And if—" She hesitated, her heart pounding. "And if we didn't end the agreement?" Their gazes met in the half-light of the living room, Newport's lights twinkling like earthly stars behind the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Imogen," he began softly, "you don't realize what you're suggesting. A child isn't a contract that can be terminated after 2 years." "I know exactly what I'm suggesting," she replied, with new determination in her voice. "But I can't make this decision alone, and I won't make it tonight. We need time." He nodded, visibly troubled. "You're right. Let's take a few days to think, separately." That night, lying in her bed, Imogen contemplated the ceiling, unable to sleep, a child, a family. Everything she had set aside in accepting this arrangement, considering that her library would be her only legacy. And now the possibility presented itself in the most unexpected way, with the most improbable man. In his room at the other end of the penthouse, Griffin also stared at the ceiling, reliving the conversation. He had never contemplated fatherhood, not since Olivia had betrayed him, breaking his trust in love, in family, in anything not contractually guaranteed. But Imogen, she was different, honest, strong, the kind of woman he would have wanted as the mother of his children if circumstances had been different. The most calculated arrangements, he thought, can never predict the mysteries of the human heart. The next 3 days were the longest Imogen had ever experienced. True to his word, Griffin gave her the space she needed to reflect. He left for Charleston, citing urgent business meetings. She returned to Boston, immersing herself in work at the library, as she had always done in times of turmoil. Surrounded by the books that had been her faithful companions throughout her life, she sought an answer. Her fingers caressed the ancient bindings, as if the wisdom of centuries could seep through her skin. What would her grandfather say about this situation? He who had always preached that life's most important decisions should be guided by the heart, but illuminated by reason. On the evening of the 3rd day, as she closed the library, a sudden rain surprised her. She took shelter under the awning of a small Italian restaurant she occasionally frequented. The owner, recognizing her, invited her in. "Alone tonight, Miss Imogen?" he asked before correcting himself. "Pardon Mrs. Blackwood now, isn't it?" She smiled sadly. "Yes, that's right, Mr. Rizzo." He led her to an isolated table and brought her a glass of Chianti without her needing to order. "To celebrate your marriage, though you seem to be carrying a weight rather than a joy." His perceptiveness surprised her. "Is it that obvious?" The old Italian shrugged. "I was married 53 years before my Maria passed. I know all the faces of marriage: joy, pain, confusion, certainty." He affectionately patted her hand. "Yours is that of someone at a crossroads." These words touched something deep within her. "How do you know which road to take?" "Ah, the big question." He smiled, revealing wrinkles of joy around his eyes. "Maria always said, 'In 50 years, what will you regret not having done?' That was her compass." This simple wisdom resonated with Imogen all night. In 50 years, would she regret letting this chance pass, not knowing what it was like to be truly Griffin's wife, not just on paper, to have a child with him? At the same moment in Charleston, Griffin contemplated the stormy sea from the balcony of his suite at the Charleston Harbor Resort. The tempest raging outside perfectly reflected the chaos of his thoughts. A call from his cousin Richard, earlier that day, had aggravated his confusion. "We all know this marriage is a farce, Griffin. Why persist? Let us take over the family's business affairs. You can still manage your personal projects." "It's not a farce," he had automatically responded. Richard's laughter had resonated at the other end of the line. "Really? You're going to tell me you've fallen in love with this provincial librarian? You, the most hardened bachelor on the eastern seaboard?" The question had haunted him all day. Was it really so unthinkable? What he felt for Imogen, that warmth that invaded him when she smiled, that peace he experienced simply knowing she was in the next room, that inexplicable pride when he had seen her stand up to Vanessa, wasn't that what ordinary people called love? He had mocked this concept for so long, considering it a weakness, an exploitable vulnerability. After Olivia, he had sworn never to expose himself like that again. But Imogen, she had done something no one had managed to do in a long time. She had made him feel human again. On the 4th day, they met at a small restaurant in Virginia, neutral ground, halfway between Boston and Charleston. The establishment, nestled in a 16th-century-style manor, offered private rooms where they could discuss without being disturbed. Imogen arrived first, dressed in a simple sky-blue dress that accentuated the clarity of her gaze. When Griffin entered, she was struck by his appearance. He seemed to have barely slept, a shadow of stubble darkening his usually impeccable jaw. They sat across from each other, separated by an antique table that had probably witnessed hundreds of decisive conversations over the centuries. "You look tired," she said softly, instinctively switching to a more informal tone for the first time. He smiled weakly. "So do you." Silence settled as the waiter brought wine and discreetly withdrew. Griffin rotated his glass between his fingers, visibly searching for words. "I've thought a lot," they began simultaneously, which drew a shared smile from them. "You first," he offered. She took a deep breath. "When I accepted this arrangement, I thought I knew exactly what I was getting into. A contract, clear terms, defined limits. But these 3 months have been different from what I imagined. For me too," he admitted. "I've realized I don't want to end our agreement, Griffin." She looked him straight in the eyes. And not just for the library. Something lit up in his gaze. A fragile, almost vulnerable hope. "What do you mean?" "I mean that what started as a transaction has become something real. For me." She hesitated, then added, "And I'm ready to consider a real future together, including a child." He remained silent for so long that she thought she had made a terrible mistake. Then slowly he reached across the table and took her hand. "I came today with the same conclusion," he said softly. "These 3 days away from you made me realize how important you've become in my life, not as a contractual obligation, but as—" he searched for the right word, "as a partner." Their hands remained linked, like a bridge between their two worlds. "It won't be easy," he warned. "My family will do everything to separate us. The board of directors is already watching me closely, and a child, it's an immense responsibility." "I know," she replied, "but I think we can do it. Together." It was a crazy, irrational, reckless decision, everything they weren't supposed to be, and yet it seemed to be the only thing that made sense in this uncertain world. "There's one condition, though," said Imogen, her expression becoming serious. "I want us to do things properly this time." "What do you mean?" "I want us to really get to know each other, to build a solid foundation, not just on paper but in reality." She squeezed his hand. "I want a real marriage before considering a child." He nodded, a new determination in his gaze. "I agree. Let's start over. Not as a businessman and a librarian bound by a contract, but as two people building something authentic." That night, for the first time, they truly shared a room in the Manor's small hotel. Not as lovers, that step seemed still too large, too rushed, but as two people who had decided to trust the unpredictable process of building a relationship. Lying side by side in the darkness, their fingers brushing in the space between them, they talked until late into the night, about their fears, their hopes, their past wounds, conversations they should have had before signing marriage papers, but which seemed all the more meaningful now that they were consciously choosing this path. "Sometimes," thought Imogen as sleep finally claimed her, "fairy tales begin after the wedding, not before." The 4th month of their marriage marked a turning point. Back in Newport, they began redefining their relationship on new foundations. More honest, more vulnerable, but also more complex. The first step was unexpected. Griffin proposed they consult a marriage therapist in New York. "A therapist?" Imogen was surprised. "I didn't think you believed in that kind of approach." "I didn't," he admitted. "But we're building something unconventional. Maybe we need outside help." Thus began their weekly trips to New York, to the discreet office of Dr. Lawrence, a woman in her 60s with penetrating eyes and a soothing voice. The first sessions were awkward, each hesitant to reveal their true fears in front of the other. "You've started your relationship backward," observed the therapist during their 3rd meeting. "Most couples meet, fall in love, then get married. You signed papers before you even really knew each other. Now, you need to rebuild the foundation while the house is already standing." This metaphor resonated deeply with them. The sessions progressively became the place where masks fell away. Griffin finally spoke openly about Olivia's betrayal, about how it had shaped his cynical view of relationships. "I believed that every display of affection necessarily hid a manipulation," he confessed during a particularly emotional session, "that no one could really be interested in me beyond my name and bank account." Imogen, touched by this rare vulnerability, took his hand. "And now," he looked at her, a new emotion in his eyes, "now I'm beginning to believe that some people see beyond appearances." She too shared her deep fears, the pressure of being perceived as an opportunist, a fortune hunter, the fear of never being taken seriously in this new world of opulence in which she now moved. "I feel like I'm constantly being judged," she admitted, "like I have to prove I'm worth more than what people see at first glance, a provincial who made a good catch." "You have nothing to prove," he responded firmly. "Certainly not to me." At home, their dynamic subtly evolved. Physical barriers began to fade, hands lingering a bit longer than necessary, gazes seeking each other across the room, a growing closeness that seemed as natural as it was inevitable. One evening, as they watched a classic film in the living room, huddled under a blanket against the unusual coolness of an Atlantic autumn, Imogen fell asleep on his shoulder. Griffin remained motionless, savoring the warmth of her presence, observing the shadows that the city lights cast on her peaceful face. He realized with sudden clarity that he had never experienced this kind of peace before, this feeling of simple fullness, this absence of the constant need to control, calculate, protect himself. With Imogen, the walls he had spent a decade building began to crumble, brick by brick, but external challenges only intensified. The board of directors of Blackwood Development began questioning his recent decisions. He was less available, less focused on numbers, more distracted, as the chairman had diplomatically phrased it. "Your wife seems to have an interesting influence on your management," his uncle Franklin had commented during a tense meeting. "We're wondering if your priorities are still aligned with those of the company." "My priorities are evolving," Griffin had responded with a frankness that shocked the assembly. Perhaps the company should evolve too. In Boston, Imogen faced her own battles. Rumors spread in the small cultural world she had always considered her family. Sidelong glances, conversations that stopped at her approach, barely veiled comments about sacrifices one makes for money. Her oldest friend Lucy, a curator at the Museum of Fine Arts, confronted her one day after work. "You've changed, Imogen," she accused. "Now that you've married a millionaire, you think you're too good for us." Hurt, Imogen tried to explain. "It's not like that. Griffin and I, it's complicated, but real." "Real?" Lucy emitted an incredulous laugh. "An arranged marriage with a man you barely knew isn't real, it's theater." These words followed her all day, resonating painfully because they reflected her own persistent doubts. Was it really real? Or was she telling herself a story to make acceptable what had begun as a transaction? That evening she returned to Newport earlier than expected, her mind troubled. The apartment was empty. Griffin was attending a conference in Cape Cod and wouldn't return until late that evening. She wandered through the spacious rooms that were finally beginning to resemble a home, with her books mixed with his on the shelves, her photos discreetly integrated into the minimalist decor. On impulse, she headed to Griffin's office, a room she rarely entered, respecting his workspace. She wasn't looking for anything specific, perhaps just a sign, a confirmation that what they were building was authentic. On the fine wood desk, among neatly arranged files and technological gadgets, an incongruous object caught her attention, a small journal bound in worn leather. She opened it, immediately recognizing handwriting that wasn't Griffin's, older, more formal. "A man without family is but a man without roots." She quickly closed the journal, ashamed of this intrusion into Griffin's privacy. But something else had caught her eye, a folder simply marked Read Library Project. With trembling hands, she opened it to discover detailed renovation plans for her library in Boston, far beyond the basic repairs she had envisioned. Griffin's handwritten notes covered the margins. "Check authenticity of materials to match original period. Consult Imogen for arrangement of new reading rooms. Temperature-controlled conservation system for 18th century manuscripts." Tears came to her eyes. These weren't the notes of a man fulfilling a contractual obligation. They were the attentions of a man who understood what was truly important to her, who cared about preserving not just the stones and books, but the very soul of this place she cherished. When Griffin returned that evening, well after midnight, he found her asleep on the living room couch, the folder clutched to her chest. He approached softly, not wanting to wake her, but her eyes opened. "You found my surprise project," he noted without anger. "I'm sorry for snooping," she murmured. It was inappropriate. He sat beside her, gently caressing her cheek. "I wanted to show it to you when the final details were settled. It's magnificent, Griffin, far beyond what I could have imagined." Their gazes met in the half-light, and she saw in his eyes what she had never dared hope for. Not the cold calculation of a businessman, but the tenderness of a man who was beginning to open his heart. "Why?" she asked simply. He took a deep breath, as if preparing to dive into unknown waters. "Because your passion for this place made me realize all that I had forgotten, the importance of preserving what has value beyond numbers, of building something that will last beyond us. That night, for the first time, they shared the same bed, not as an obligation or a calculated step, but as the natural expression of an intimacy that had built day by day, conversation after conversation, revelation after revelation. As the dawn light filtered through the curtains, drawing dancing patterns on the sheets, Imogen contemplated Griffin's sleeping face, relaxed, vulnerable, devoid of the mask he wore to the world. She realized that despite all the doubts and obstacles, despite the strangeness of their path, she was exactly where she needed to be. The most unexpected paths, she thought, as she tenderly caressed his cheek, sometimes lead to the most fitting destinations. The renovation project of the Reed Library officially began in the 5th month of their marriage. What was supposed to be a simple cornerstone-laying ceremony became a major cultural event in Boston. Local press, academics, museum curators, all crowded to see what real estate magnate Griffin Blackwood would do with this venerable literary institution. Under a fall sky with golden hues, Imogen stood by Griffin's side, moved by the vision taking shape. The architect he had hired, a brilliant woman specializing in the restoration of historic buildings, presented plans that respected the soul of the place while infusing it with new life. "We'll preserve all the original woodwork," she explained to the assembly. "The stained glass will be restored by master craftsmen from Savannah. The new wing, designed to house the medieval manuscript collection, will integrate harmoniously with the existing structure while offering the most advanced conservation technologies." Griffin, usually reserved during public events, spoke with a passion that surprised observers. "This project is not simply an architectural restoration," he declared. "It's the preservation of a vital cultural heritage for Boston and for America. Each book, each manuscript in this library tells a part of our collective history." He turned to Imogen, a warm smile lighting his face. "And no one understands the importance of this heritage better than the director of this library, my wife, who has dedicated her life to these literary treasures." The sincerity of his words deeply touched Imogen. It wasn't the prepared speech of a businessman seeking to polish his public image. It was the authentic declaration of a man who was beginning to see the value of things beyond their financial return. The work progressed rapidly. Every weekend, instead of flying to the Hamptons or Martha's Vineyard as he would have done before, Griffin joined Imogen in Boston. Together they monitored progress, she bringing her expertise on the collections, he ensuring that every detail was executed to perfection. What surprised everyone, including Imogen, was seeing Griffin literally roll up his sleeves to participate in the work. One rainy Saturday in November, she discovered him in jeans and a t-shirt, working alongside craftsmen to restore the ancient oak beams. "You don't have to do this," she told him, amused and touched by this image so far removed from the powerful businessman in an impeccable suit. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, leaving a trace of wood dust. "I grew up helping my grandfather restore his farm in Vermont, before my father decided it wasn't an occupation worthy of a Blackwood. He caressed the wood, patinated by centuries. I had forgotten how much I enjoyed working with my hands, creating something tangible." She looked at him with new eyes, seeing beyond the businessman, the New England boy his father had forced to grow up too quickly, who had never been given permission to simply love things without them having a monetary value. One evening, as they were cataloguing together rare 18th century volumes recently acquired, a violent storm hit Boston. The wind howled against the stained glass, the rain drummed on the centuries-old roof, and suddenly an ominous cracking sound resonated. "The dome scaffolding!" Imogen exclaimed. They rushed to the main rotunda, where water was beginning to seep through a breach in the temporary protection. Without hesitation, Griffin climbed the rickety scaffolding to secure the tarp torn by the wind, while Imogen organized a human chain with the workers present to put the precious books in safety. For 2 hours they fought against the elements, soaked to the bone but determined to protect this irreplaceable heritage. When finally the situation was under control, they found themselves alone in the silent library, illuminated only by some emergency lamps, listening to the storm that continued to rage outside. Griffin, kneeling near a crate of manuscripts he had just secured, looked up at Imogen. Her wet hair framed her face, animated by adrenaline and effort. Her soaked clothes clung to her silhouette, and in the dim light, She appeared more beautiful than ever to him, authentic, passionate, untamable, like the storm itself. "I love you," he said simply, the words he had sworn never to pronounce again leaving his lips with disconcerting ease. Time seemed to stop. Imogen looked at him, breathless, searching in his eyes for the slightest trace of hesitation, calculation, or doubt. She found only raw vulnerability and quiet certainty. Tears mingled with raindrops on her cheeks as she approached him. "I love you too," she murmured. "I fought against this feeling, but I love you." That night, isolated from the world by the storm, surrounded by silent witnesses of centuries of love stories immortalized in ink and paper, they made love for the first time, not as a duty or an obligation, but as the natural expression of a feeling that had grown between them despite all barriers. Morning found them asleep on an antique couch in the director's office, wrapped in a wool blanket found in a closet, their bodies intertwined like the roots of a tree that sink deeply into the ground to resist storms. Imogen contemplated Griffin's peaceful face in the nascent light. He looked different. The lines of tension that usually marked his forehead had faded, replaced by a serenity she had never seen before. "What begins as an arrangement," she thought as she tenderly caressed his cheek, "can transform into something no contract could ever define." "I think we should create a foundation," Griffin announced one December morning as they had breakfast on the apartment terrace in Newport, enjoying the winter sun on the Atlantic. Imogen looked up from her book, intrigued. "A foundation for the preservation of American literary and architectural heritage," he specified, his eyes shining with an excitement she had rarely seen. "Not just your library, but similar projects across the country, places that hold our collective memory but lack funding." She smiled, touched by this evolution. 6 months earlier, Griffin would never have considered investing in something without immediate financial return. "That's a wonderful idea. You would head the project selection committee, of course," he continued. "No one understands the value of these places better than you." This proposal marked a turning point. It was no longer Griffin helping Imogen with her library, nor Imogen adapting to Griffin's world. It was the creation of something new together, a project that embodied the values they had discovered in each other. The following weeks were devoted to bringing this vision to life. Imogen involved herself in the legal and organizational aspects, discovering an unsuspected talent for strategic planning. Griffin, for his part, began integrating his knowledge of cultural conservation into his real estate projects, developing a more respectful approach to local heritage. They now truly worked as partners, each bringing their strengths to their common enterprise. The barriers that once separated their worlds had gradually erased, creating a new space where both could thrive. Their personal relationship deepened in parallel. The nights spent in separate rooms seemed to belong to another life. They had found a common rhythm. Imogen appreciated quiet mornings with a book while Griffin swam in the building's pool. He had learned to respect her occasional need for solitude, while she understood his moments of intense concentration on a project. One evening, as they dined at their favorite restaurant nestled in the hills above Newport, Griffin broached the subject they had carefully avoided since the night of the storm at the library. "I believe we're ready," he said softly, taking her hand across the table. She didn't need to ask what he was referring to. "You mean, for a child?" He nodded, deep emotion in his gaze. "Not to satisfy the will clause, not as an obligation, but because I want a family with you, Imogen. I want to build something that will last well beyond us." Tears came to her eyes. It was everything she had hoped to hear, but had never dared ask for. "Are you sure? It's a huge step." "I've never been more certain of anything," he affirmed. "These past 6 months have transformed me. You have transformed me." He squeezed her hand, his thumb gently caressing the wedding band that had acquired a meaning far beyond its initial function. "I want to be a father. I want to see you be a mother. I want to create a family that will know the love I never received as a child." That night, their love took on a new dimension, no longer just the expression of their personal connection, but the potential beginning of a new life, of a future they had chosen to create together. The days passed in a harmony that seemed almost unreal after the turbulence of the previous months. The library renovation was progressing beautifully. The foundation was taking shape, attracting the attention of influential cultural figures. Even the board of directors of Blackwood Development was beginning to recognize the benefits of this new direction, as projects combining luxury and heritage preservation attracted wealthy clientele concerned with environment and history. Then, on a cold January morning, everything collapsed. Imogen was preparing breakfast when Griffin received a call that made him pale. He hung up slowly, as if numbed. "What's happening?" she asked, alarmed. "The New York Times is going to publish an article tomorrow," he said in a strangely calm voice, "exposing the details of our initial arrangement." She sat down slowly, the news hitting her like a physical blow. "How?" "James Harrington, a former associate I removed from a project in the Hamptons 2 years ago. He apparently had contacts with Attorney Montgomery." He passed a trembling hand over his face. "They have copies of our preliminary discussions, details on payments, everything." The world seemed to crumble around Imogen. Everything they had built with such care, their reputation, their credibility, the nascent foundation, all was threatened. "What can we do?" she asked, struggling to maintain her composure. "Nothing to prevent publication, but we can decide how to react." The hours that followed were a whirlwind of phone calls and emergency meetings. Griffin's lawyer advised a categorical denial. His public relations officer suggested a temporary retreat away from the media. His uncle Franklin, sensing an opportunity, was already calling to offer his help by temporarily taking the reins of the company. In the midst of this chaos, Imogen observed Griffin, his tense face, his shoulders hunched under the weight of this imminent crisis. She suddenly realized that, despite everything, what she feared was not public shame or even the impact on her projects. What she truly feared was losing him, seeing their progress destroyed, returning to the time when walls and contracts defined their relationship. As the crisis team discussed strategies and scenarios, she approached him and took his hand. "What if we simply told the truth?" she proposed softly. All eyes turned to her, incredulous. "The truth?" repeated the public relations officer. "Mrs. Blackwood, with all due respect, confirming that your marriage began as a business transaction would be media suicide." "Not the whole truth," she specified, eyes fixed on Griffin. "Our truth. That yes, our marriage began as an arrangement, but it transformed into something real, authentic, something neither of us had anticipated." Griffin looked at her, a light of understanding kindling in his eyes. "You're suggesting we take the initiative? That we tell our story on our terms?" She nodded. "Exactly. Without shame, without excuses. Just honesty." A thoughtful silence settled in the room. Then Griffin stood, dismissing his team with a gesture. "Leave us, please. My wife and I need to discuss this privately." Once alone, he approached her, taking her hands in his. "Are you sure you want to expose yourself like this? It will be brutal. The press will tear us apart." "Your colleagues in Boston." "I'm tired of living in fear of being discovered," she responded with a firmness that surprised him. "Yes, our story began in an unconventional way, but what we've built since then is real, and I'm not ashamed of it." He drew her to him, burying his face in her hair. "I don't deserve you," he murmured. She smiled against his shoulder. "Probably not. But you have me anyway." The next morning, as expected, the New York Times published on its front page, "Millionaire Marriage Exposed as a Sham." The article, filled with salacious details and malevolent insinuations, presented their union as a cynical transaction aimed solely at circumventing testamentary clauses. But even before the newspaper ink was dry, Griffin and Imogen appeared on the set of America's most watched morning show. Hand in hand, they told their story. The real one, with its calculated beginnings, its awkward moments, its unexpected discoveries, and its evolution toward an authentic love that had surprised them both. "Yes, our marriage began as an arrangement," Griffin admitted with a frankness that destabilized the interviewer, accustomed to celebrities' categorical denials. "We didn't know each other. We each had our practical motivations. But what we hadn't foreseen," continued Imogen, "is that behind the facades we presented to the world, we would discover people we truly wanted to share our lives with. Their honesty disarmed even the most cynical commentators. The vulnerability with which Griffin, known for his glacial reserve, spoke of his personal transformation, and Imogen's quiet dignity in the face of the most intrusive questions, created a powerful impression. "Many will doubt our sincerity," Imogen concluded, "and that's their right. But we know what we've built together, and that's all that matters to us." Leaving the studio, They expected to face an unleashed media storm, but something unexpected happened. Their story, this modern version of an inverted fairy tale where marriage precedes love rather than crowning it, began to resonate with the public. Couples with similar paths emerged from the shadows to share their experiences. Sociologists debated the evolution of matrimonial models in modern society. Novelists contacted their agents to propose stories inspired by their story. Of course, there were bitter criticisms, cruel mockeries, dubious psychological analyses. But as days, then weeks passed, something remarkable happened. Their honesty had transformed what could have been a devastating scandal into a national conversation about love, social conventions, and the unpredictable paths of the human heart. One evening, a month after the media storm, as they walked hand in hand along Newport's Cliff Walk, an elderly lady stopped them. "I saw you on television," she said, with a pronounced New England accent. "My husband and we too had an arranged marriage by our families, 63 years together before he passed." Her eyes shone with contained tears. "Love sometimes comes after the vows, doesn't it? And it's all the stronger for having been chosen rather than imposed by destiny." These words accompanied them as they continued their walk in the twilight, the city lights coming on one by one, like earthly stars guiding their path. "She's right, you know," murmured Imogen, squeezing Griffin's hand. "What we have is all the more precious because we've consciously chosen it, day after day." He stopped, drawing her to him facing the infinite ocean. "And I continue to choose you, every morning when I wake up beside you." That night, cuddled against each other under the sheets, they discussed the future, no longer as a business plan to execute, but as an adventure to live together, with all its uncertainties and wonderful possibilities. The most lasting love, thought Imogen as she fell asleep in the arms of the man who had gone from stranger to husband to lover to life partner, is the one that surprises us when we weren't looking for it. Spring arrived with an explosion of cherry blossoms in Newport and a sweetness in the air that seemed to reflect the progressive calming of the media storm. 6 months had passed since that first night at the Biltmore estate in Asheville. 6 months that had transformed two strangers, bound by a contract, into partners, united by love. The Reed Library now shone in all its splendor after months of meticulous restoration. The inauguration was scheduled for the next day, an event that was attracting the attention of the American and European cultural world, marking not only the renaissance of a literary treasure, but also the culmination of a personal journey for Imogen and Griffin. On the eve of this great celebration, they decided to spend a last night alone in the building before it returned to being a public space. A personal tradition had established itself over the past months. Each major milestone in the renovation had been followed by a private moment between them within these walls charged with history. They walked hand in hand among the restored shelves, admiring how the twilight light filtered through the repaired stained glass, creating dancing patterns on the polished oak floor. "Do you remember our first dinner here?" asked Imogen, stopping in front of the 19th century American literature section. "You were so uncomfortable, sitting on that old wobbly chair in your $10,000 suit." He smiled at the memory. "I mostly remember listening to you talk about Thoreau and Emerson for 2 hours and realizing I had never met someone so passionate about anything. And now, look at you," she teased. "You can quote Walden from memory." "Only your favorite passages," he admitted, drawing her to him. Night was gently falling on Boston, wrapping the library in a cocoon of intimacy. They had prepared a simple picnic that they set up in the central rotunda. Fresh bread, cheese, fruit, a bottle of Napa Valley red wine. Around them, thousands of books seemed to watch over their happiness like benevolent witnesses. "I have something for you," said Griffin, pulling a small package from his pocket. Imogen opened it to discover an antique silver locket. Inside was not a photo, but a tiny fragment of yellowed paper protected under glass. "It's—" She broke off, moved to tears as she recognized the distinctive handwriting. "A fragment of an autograph letter by Thoreau," he confirmed. "I worked with a manuscript expert to authenticate and preserve this piece. It's a letter he wrote about the concept of self-reliance." She caressed the locket, deeply touched by the meaning of the gift. "How did you know?" "You once told me that Thoreau represented for you the ideal of the engaged writer who never ceased to believe in the fundamental goodness of nature despite trials." He took her hand. "It seemed appropriate to mark our journey." She kissed him tenderly, grateful for this additional proof that he truly listened to her, that he understood what made her soul vibrate. As they savored their wine, huddled on cushions among the books, the sky above the glass dome darkened. Clouds were gathering, presaging a spring storm. "Looks like we'll be reliving our night of tempest," observed Griffin with a knowing smile. As if to confirm his words, lightning zigzagged across the sky, followed a few seconds later by the rumble of thunder. Rain began to drum on the roof, creating a symphony that resonated in the tranquil space. Imogen nestled against him, savoring the warmth of his presence, contrasting with the fury of the elements outside. "This library seems to attract storms when we're together. Perhaps it has a sense of drama," he joked. Another flash of lightning illuminated the rotunda, revealing for a fraction of a second the exquisite details of the restored dome. Then darkness returned, deeper than before. "The lights," Imogen murmured, as the electricity flickered before going out completely. Griffin lit some candles they had brought, creating a circle of golden light around them. Shadows danced on the shelves, bringing centuries-old books to life. In this almost magical atmosphere, isolated from the world by the storm and darkness, they talked about the future they envisioned together, no longer as a business plan, but as a shared adventure. The foundation they had created was gaining momentum, attracting prestigious partners. Griffin's company was evolving toward a more balanced vision of development, integrating heritage conservation and sustainable innovation. And at the center of all this, their relationship continued to deepen, like a root that sinks a little deeper into the ground each day. "I have news," Imogen said softly, her face illuminated by the flickering candlelight. Something in her tone caught Griffin's attention. "What kind of news?" She took his hand and placed it gently on her belly. "The kind that changes a life." Time seemed to suspend as he grasped the meaning of her gesture. "You're—" She nodded, tears of joy shining in her eyes. "Pregnant. 8 weeks. I wanted to be sure before telling you." The emotion that overwhelmed Griffin was so pure, so intense, that it left him momentarily speechless. He who had spent his adult life controlling every aspect of his existence, calculating every risk, anticipating every outcome, found himself facing a miracle he hadn't planned, but welcomed with all his heart. "A child," he finally murmured, his voice trembling with emotion. "Our child." He drew her to him, kissing her with infinite tenderness. "You make me the happiest man in the world, Imogen Blackwood." The storm was still raging outside, but in their circle of light, surrounded by the silent witnesses of centuries of human stories, they created their own universe. A universe where love, born from the most improbable circumstances, flourished like a rare flower, finding its place in an unexpected garden. "I love you," he murmured against her lips. "Not because a contract requires it, not to satisfy a testamentary clause, but because you've transformed my vision of the world." "I love you," she responded, "not for the security you offer, not for the walls you've restored, but for the walls you've let fall." That night, as the rain washed the world outside, they lost themselves in each other, celebrating the new life growing between them, the perfect symbol of their union that had transcended its calculated origins to become something deeply authentic. As the first light of dawn filtered through the stained glass, bathing the library in a golden light after the storm, Imogen watched Griffin sleeping peacefully, his protective hand resting on her belly. She realized that their story was now much larger than themselves. It would continue through the child they had created, through the library they had saved together, through all the projects they had seeded in the world. The most unexpected arrangements, she thought as she tenderly caressed his hair, can sometimes give birth to the most beautiful love stories. A year had passed since that first night at the Biltmore estate in Asheville, a year of transformations, challenges, discoveries, and growing love. Imogen stood at the window of the same suite, contemplating the illuminated gardens in the Asheville night. The city spread below her like a carpet of golden lights, unchanged and yet so different in her eyes now. Griffin had insisted on celebrating their anniversary where everything had begun, not as a simple romantic tradition, but as a way to measure the path traveled, to remember where they came from, to better appreciate where they were now. The bathroom door opened, and he appeared, simply dressed in pants and a white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, so different from the man in an impeccable suit who had stood by that same window a year earlier, carefully keeping his distance. "What are you thinking about?" he asked as he approached, encircling her waist from behind. She leaned back against him, savoring the warmth of his body. "I was thinking about us, about how everything has changed." He placed a kiss in her hair. "For the better, I hope. Without a shadow of a doubt." She turned in his arms, facing the man who had gone from stranger to husband, from associate to lover, from calculator to father-to-be. Her belly, rounded by 5 months of pregnancy, gently pressed against him, the living proof of their transformation. "I have a gift for you," she said, heading toward her suitcase. She extracted an antique book with a binding of leather worn by the years. "I found it at an antiquarian in Providence last month." Griffin took the volume with reverence, immediately recognizing a first edition of Thoreau's Walden, the novel that had marked their first true connection in this same room. "It's extraordinary," he murmured, caressing the cover with respect. "Open it," she encouraged with a mysterious smile. He discovered an inscription on the flyleaf, the ink browned by time. "To my dear son, may this story always remind you that appearances can hide the deepest truths of the heart. With all my love, your father, Edmund." Griffin remained motionless, trembling fingers on the page. "This is my father's handwriting. How—" "I contacted your Aunt Eleanor in Vermont," explained Imogen. "She told me that your father had sold his collection of rare books when the company was going through difficulties in the beginning. This volume traveled for decades before ending up in that bookstore." Tears shone in Griffin's eyes. He who never cried, who had learned from childhood to consider emotion a weakness. It was his favorite book. He would read me passages when I was a child before he changed. Imogen took his face between her hands, tenderly wiping away a stray tear on his cheek. "Perhaps he wasn't just the ruthless businessman you knew later. Perhaps there were other facets to him, as there were in you." He drew her to him, burying his face in her neck, letting the last barriers protecting his heart fall. "Thank you," he murmured, "for this gift, for everything." When he straightened up, his gaze had changed, softer, more open, as if a final piece of the puzzle of his soul had just found its place. "I have something for you too," he said, heading toward his jacket hanging near the door. He extracted an envelope that he handed her with an indecipherable expression. Inside, Imogen found an official document, the deed of ownership of the Reed Library, transferred from the foundation they had created to her personal name. "I don't understand," she said, perplexed. "Why remove it from the foundation?" "Look at the second page," he responded softly. She turned the page to discover a second document, a new marriage contract that nullified and replaced their initial arrangement. "I thought it was time to rewrite our story," he explained. "This new contract simply stipulates that everything we own, everything we create, everything we are, is equally shared. No limited duration clause. No predefined financial compensation. Just us building a life together for as long as we choose." Emotion tightened Imogen's throat, making it difficult to form words. "You didn't need to do this. I trust you." "I know," he said, taking her hands. "It's not a matter of trust, it's a declaration of intent. A way of saying that what began as a business arrangement has become the very heart of my life." He knelt before her, a gesture he had never made during their first hasty union at Boston City Hall. "Imogen Blackwood, will you remain my wife? Not for a contract, not for a library or a testamentary clause, but because I can no longer imagine my life without you?" Tears flowed freely down her cheeks as she raised him up. "Yes," she murmured. 1,000 times yes. They sealed this second promise with a kiss that contained the entire story of their journey, the initial distrust, the gradual discovery, the nascent passion, and finally this deep love that had transformed them both. Later, as they lay in bed, their bodies intertwined in the sweet intimacy of lovers who know each other deeply, Imogen felt the first movements of the baby in her womb, like a silent approval of this future they had chosen to create together. Griffin placed his hand on her rounded belly, marveling at this new life that was growing, the perfect symbol of their improbable union. "What shall we name him?" he asked softly. She smiled in the half-light. "If it's a boy, I had thought of William, like my grandfather. And if it's a girl, Eliza," he completed with a knowing smile. "For Emerson's wife, of course, but also for what we've accomplished together. A victory against conventions, against our own prejudices, against all those who doubted us. She tenderly caressed his face, recognizing in his features the man he had become, still strong and determined, but now capable of a tenderness and vulnerability he would never have dared show before. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "when I signed that first contract in Attorney Montgomery's office, I thought I was sacrificing a part of my dignity to save my library. And now?" he asked. "Now I know that on that day, without knowing it, I signed up for the most beautiful adventure of my life." Outside, Asheville's lights twinkled like earthly stars, silent witnesses to this love story that had defied all conventions. The Biltmore estate stood majestic and unchanging, having seen centuries of political alliances, arranged marriages, and sometimes, as in their case, those improbable unions that transform into true love stories. Nestled in her husband's arms, Imogen thought about the strange beauty of destiny, how a calculated arrangement had opened the door to a connection so deep that no contract could have defined it. How two people, who were simply seeking to preserve their respective heritage, had ended up creating something far more precious together. Sometimes, she thought as sleep gently claimed her, the most beautiful journeys begin with the most unexpected detours. And as night enveloped the mountain city in its starry mantle, two people who had met as strangers bound by a contract fell asleep as soulmates united by love, the living proof that destiny's arrangements are sometimes wiser than all our calculations.